Hi, hello there, Allison.
Hey, Scott.
Cool. Good to see you. All right, I think we've got some folks that are joining in now. Hey, Guy.
I see Guy.
All right. Give everyone a couple more minutes to join in. Hey, Jacob. Guys, we're going to get started in just about a minute. Pretty excited for our first Firneo Business Roundtable. So we're going to see how we can get everybody into the mix of the conversation. Excited about this subject, something that I personally know and love nearly and dearly, subject of partnerships between startups and large companies. So we're going to kick that off. I think we have some more folks that are streaming into the chat. So for those who are here, just a little bit of a logistical note. I think some of you have already discovered that there's the chat box on the right. That is where, if you have a question, you can kind of ask the question there. And then what will happen is that as we get along, we'll be able to incorporate some of those questions into the mix and invite some people on screen to talk if your camera and microphone are working. We'll bring you on screen to kind of share your story, your question, and really try to make this as interactive as possible. So we'll give everyone just one more minute, and then we'll kick things off officially.
Awesome.
I think we've got, so I see Brett and Jim. Hello. Shri, welcome. So in case you're wondering, the only way to really interact at this moment is through that chat box. So again, ask if you have a question, a comment, a story to share, type it in there. And then as we get a little bit further in, we'll make sure we try to bring some folks on screen to ask those questions, to share their stories. I want to make this as interactive as possible, but the kind of starting point for that is just to kind of post a question over in that box. And then we'll try to bring some folks on board. And if your mic and camera are working on your computer, it should be pretty seamless, as technology, of course, always is. So I think on that note, we've got quorum. Let's kick this thing off and chat a little bit more. So first off, thank you to everybody for joining, and especially Allison. I'm super excited about what we are doing today. This is our first Firneo Business Development virtual roundtable with the subject of how startups can partner with large companies. And so I'm excited to be joined by Allison Baker, Head of Partnerships at Dashlane, and previously of American Express. I'm also excited to be joined by everybody else here that's on the virtual roundtable with us now, and for those folks who will be listening in the future. So we're going to kick off. And just to confirm, before we do that, I want to note that, as I was saying a moment ago, this isn't an interview. It's a roundtable discussion. It's meant to be really interactive, and we want to hear everybody in the room's perspectives, stories, questions. And so to do that, again, if you're kind of joining us a little late, there's a chat box that you'll be able to see on the right. That is a place to kind of add your questions, your stories, your comments. And we'll be able to add folks to the live chat to kind of pop up on screen if your mic and camera are working and engage in the conversation. And for those who are technically limited due to whatever technical difficulties, we'll make sure that we address as many of those questions and raise as many of those stories as possible. So let's get started. So Allison, again, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So, the subject of the conversation is David plus Goliath, how startups can partner with large companies. I feel like your story is kind of unique because you've been on both sides of that. I'd just love to hear, if you want to share with everyone your story and how you kind of came to where you are today at Dashlane and how you've gotten to be on both sides of the negotiating table as both David and Goliath.
Absolutely. Well, it's awesome to see everybody in this little cool chat box here on the right. Looking forward to talking with all you guys today. So yeah, I have a little bit of a unique background. So I started my career at American Express, as Scott said, but before I got there, I actually thought I wanted to be a food scientist. That's kind of what I focused on in college. And I was focused on doing food new product development, but then it was like 2010, the economy wasn't so great. I threw out a job flyer to American Express and ended up working there first as an intern doing.
Were you studying?
I had like 6 cousins who were food scientists and agriculture people at Cornell. So I was pretty convinced that I wanted to do that. And then I realized that I was absolutely horrendous at chemistry and that wasn't going to work out. So pretty quickly between that and applying to Amex, food new product development very quickly became digital new product development, which apparently Amex was cool with. So that's how I kind of got the start there. And then I was fortunate when I was at American Express in my first role there, I was on one of the really genuinely innovative digital product development teams that they had building new products at that time. And, 6 months in, I pretty quickly learned that digital new product development at a large company like that is super challenging, mostly because the budgets are set 3 months prior. It takes 6 months to get everybody on board with a strategy. When you actually come up with a strategy, you need to have someone do a whole competitive analysis of the field, do a pro and cons of every single player, look at all the different guys involved. Then you have to get your own tech team. By the time you actually get yourself positioned to build something, it's 12 months later and the opportunity's passed. So very quickly, that new product development focus became partnering with startups. So
can I just real quick, just to clarify? So, American Express, I'm familiar with it because I, of course, worked there. But just to kind of clarify what your experience was there, digital new product development. We think of credit cards, we think of traveler's checks. What was digital new product development at Amex, and when was this that you?
Yeah, so I joined around 2010 as an intern, and I ended up staying for about 6 years. So when I was there, every business unit, there was about 8 at the time, had its own kind of new product development team, which can mean a lot of different things. For my group, it was focused on the merchant side of the business. We were developing products that would essentially kind of make businesses like us a little bit more, even though we were charging, more than Visa, MasterCard were in the network card business. So it was about helping to raise our net promoter score with merchants, figuring out ways that we could work with the card team to drive spend on the card. So I actually, in my time there, did very little working in payments tech. It was more about coming up with new products to support businesses, all the way from enterprise businesses down to very small merchants, figuring out ways that we could drive their American Express cardholder business.
Right. So you knew the goal of what you were working on was always about kind of getting merchants to have a better experience, to accept Amex more.
Exactly. It was all about driving the value prop, coming up with new stuff. So, we spent a lot of time concepting new ideas. We just, to put it nicely, maybe weren't the best position to actually build those internally.
How do you
It's one of those things where even if you would come up with the idea, it was one of those environments where you really had to come up with your own tech team. You had to kind of wrestle the budget away from somebody else. Things take 8 months longer because you require getting 10, 12 different teams on board to make sure everybody's feeling right about the same idea. So, Amex is one of the more innovative big companies out there, especially in the Fortune 500, but it was even pretty challenging for them just to move at the speed that you would need to do. The teams are pretty, stretched really thin on the tech side. It can be challenging to handle a lot of different things at once, meet a lot of different goals. So they're just not as well positioned as is any big company to move quickly on building new digital products.
It's interesting because I feel like we hear all the time about large companies moving slowly. Especially when you're on the startup side, that's kind of like the standard meme of large companies are Goliaths. They take a long time to move or do anything. But it sounds like you're suggesting that getting your own tech team or getting resources was one of the challenges to kind of launching something new.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, a lot of times, even I've seen it on the startup side, you think they're being slow to work on the contracts and all that stuff. And yes, that's absolutely true. But it's what's happening behind the scenes. Like it would take a few months for me even to get the resources of a tech team that I could start having conversations with startups. It wasn't actually the contract. It was, how do I get those resources? What period of time do I have them? How much cash do I have for agencies to balance those things out? So it was a lot of even seeing the opportunity, but then figuring out how we could position ourselves to even begin. That's the part that was taking months and months. And it's a little bit easier when you get to the partnership side and can kind of skip over that part for some more lightweight pilots.
So you're looking at partnerships as a way around the lack of resources, the amount of internal planning.
Exactly. I mean, I started doing partnerships because it was very clear to me that there was already some really cool players in all the different spaces that I was looking at, people that, breathed those spaces day in and day out, had fully fledged teams, could move quickly, we could take their tech. And a lot of times, at Amex and a lot of other big companies, you have to really demonstrate some pretty serious results if you're going to get a team, from your testing and to roll something out big. So it was just more economical. It was faster. It was easier to display results in year. If we were to partner into a startup, use their good tech and quickly get results.
I mean, there's a lot of surprising things that I feel like most people would find already in what you said. First is that like the resources weren't as readily available as you'd expect to do whatever you wanted in-house, which I feel like is oftentimes, you look at a giant company, you think there's unlimited budgets, you think there's unlimited resources. Sounds like you're saying the opposite. And the other surprising thing is that as a workaround to that, you're a large company that wanted to go work with startups to get around it, which is obviously something that we often think is the coming from the other side, right? The startups, of course, want to work with large companies, but you were saying that Amex wanted to work with small companies.
I was saying that I at Amex wanted to work with small companies. It's about finding the right people. I mean, I do this now coming from the Dashlane side. You can find generally people you find with like innovation titles and stuff like that are a little more amenable. But, even internally, even when I came up with an idea for a product, found the right startup, the right tech, you still had to do a lot of convincing internally to say, the build versus buy versus partner conversation was always present. And every time you went to get a new stakeholder on board, you had to have that same conversation all over again. Why aren't we building this? Why aren't we doing this? And, a lot of people can be convinced with speed and numbers and all those things fast, but you really have to find the advocates that believe in that. And, fortunately, I was working for a senior leader. He's one of the most talented people that's ever worked at Amex, and he really believed in that because we can move fast. So that definitely helped clear some boundaries for me internally, but it's a battle on both sides.
I mean, so that's an important point that I feel like you're kind of alluding to here, which is that you were the person who was the advocate. You were kind of pushing for this whatever 160-something-year-old company to do something, in a new way. I mean, let me ask you, was that new, or was there any sort of precedent that you saw of Amex working with startups that gave you, a certain confidence or gave you a certain, foundation that you can rely on to say, hey, we've done this before?
Totally. I was lucky to come in. There was a team that I was actually part of that had kind of broken the ground maybe 24 months prior when they did kind of the first innovative product partnerships with Facebook and Twitter. And those are really monumental shifts because at those time, 8 years ago, those guys weren't as big as they are now. They weren't as flexible. They had never worked with networks before. So since those turned out to be relatively successful, even from a PR front, just alone on the PR front, making Amex look like it had gone in the 21st century, building new cool products, that was valuable. So those definitely helped set there's at least a little bit of precedent here for successful partnerships. But once you get into hey, we have to demonstrate an actual ROI, all these things, you're still breaking new ground all the time because every space is so different, as are the players. And there isn't necessarily the same appetite for risk in different groups.
Right. So in the group that you were part of, it seemed like you got lucky in some ways to be in a group that had those precedents, that had a leader who, making decisions that saw the value here. I mean, did you see any other examples within the company where people weren't quite as
absolutely.
fortunate?
I mean, those were my first couple of roles when I was working in a team that was, specifically dedicated to that. At Amex, and I think this is the case with a lot of big companies, you shift around a lot. I was there for 6 years. I had 4 different roles as I went from an analyst to a senior manager. And my last role there, I was focused on our B2B enterprise business on the merchant side. So things like, how do you drive Amex share of wallet when the core business is checks in ECH? Like, that is super old school. And it's like moving mountains because you're trying to convince merchants that they need to overhaul their AR systems and this stuff that's been in place for, years and years and years, and their teams managed to dedicate it. So it was challenging. I'll be honest, that was one of those things where you had to figure out the different stakeholders to get on board. You didn't have the senior leadership support. It was actually a little different where I was working with our client management team who was out with merchants in the field, literally going out, talking to merchants, listening to what they needed and building a case that way. If you don't have it from the top, then you have to go wide to get that support. I was trying to build more support for just innovation in general versus actual partnerships. So that was a little bit more of a low bar.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So you were at Amex for about 6 years in a bunch of different roles. You saw the good side, the bad side of trying to do cool new stuff in the company and work with startups. How did you make your transition to the other side?
So it was really interesting. So I'd honestly been looking after about like 6 years at Amex. I'd been there since I was 20. I realized that I knew absolutely nothing else. So, and I'd always kind of dreamed, the joke was that I was Amex's startup person because I loved meeting with them, realizing the passion, the energy, just how quickly they could move. So that was something that was super attractive for me. And I got fortunate that Dashlane actually reached out to me because everyone knew Dashlane as a password manager, but it actually has this really cool feature that's essentially digital wallet that doesn't require any merchant integration. So when you store your credit cards in Dashlane, you can store your shipping information and your credit card information. And when you're checking out online and have the Dashlane app running in the background, one click to fill out your shipping, one click to fill out your credit card, and you're checked out. So we basically make every site on the planet as easy as Amazon. And that was something where they knew that there was a big opportunity to partner with banks and networks. So the reason they went after me is I had previously worked on a product that was trying to streamline checkouts, but I also had done a lot of partnerships with startups. So they were looking for someone that understood both sides.
Got it. And so just to clarify for folks who are maybe less familiar with Dashlane, it's a password manager, right? So it's a plugin for your browser, stores all your passwords securely. And so it sounds like the kind of innovation on their side that brought you to light for them was that it can store more than just passwords. It can store your credit card.
Exactly. I mean, to be honest with you, like Dashlane, we now have about 10 million users, 7,000 businesses that are using the app. When I joined about 2.5 years ago, it was half that. I had never even heard of Dashlane, let alone the concept of a password manager. So it took a little bit of research for me to actually understand what I was getting into. But when they showed me the digital wallet piece, I honestly quit Amex a week later because I knew it was going to be such a game changer in the space. It was something that I had never seen before. The not requiring a merchant integration was a total game changer for the space, and it's been what was holding back networks forever. So it was that specific feature, and that they wanted someone who knew how to navigate banks and networks. That was appealing to me to do it from the other side.
So you were at Amex, you saw how difficult it was for merchants to basically integrate some new technology to have credit cards automatically stored and all that. You saw Dashlane basically made that possible much more simply without having to do all sorts of tech work on a merchant side, and that drew you there. So did that give you a sense of like what your partnership strategy could be? I mean, it sounds like that was a core source of the value that you were going to take to a partner and be like, this is what 100%. We can do together.
And it's one of those things where I think people, especially from the startup side, often are challenged in going after big companies because they'll say, oh, here's a value prop, and it's like very generic to the company. Like, whereas that one person that you're going after doesn't necessarily care because it's a very narrow thing. Whereas when I joined Dashlane, I knew to go after the teams that had previously been working in digital wallets, in merchant services, or they had something around driving share of spend in certain categories. So I could go after them and say, listen, I have an app that is a super lightweight download. We can do an express checkout on every site on the internet. We can solve this, and this for you. By the way, we can set you up in a pilot with zero work for you, zero upfront cost. And by the way, we already have a contract. You just have to sign. So it was one of those things where we knew the space really well, we knew the value props, but we also knew the pain points internally of actually getting that thing done. Any type of partnership with a big company is going to require a pilot almost 90% of the time. And if you can do it without someone having to navigate to get a budget or navigate to get a tech team or a lot of different senior approvals and demonstrate results within that year before they have their year-end goals, you're golden. Like that hits all the major things. So that's how we were able to kind of put that package together and just go after all the banks and networks.
Very cool. So just for all the other folks that are in the room with us, I'd love to know if anyone else here has any similar experiences of seeing kind of both sides and realizing the value that a startup could have when they were on the other side of the table. So if anyone has any other experiences they'd like to jump in with, just type a comment, say I got something on the chat box, and we'll loop you in, and we'd love to hear that story as well. So, Allison, just you got to Dashlane, and what did you start with? Right? How did you got a sense of what the value was, but what was your day one like for you when you got to the other side of the David versus Goliath?
You know what? I still remember it because it was very much a wake-up call for me. I think when I was at Amex, I kind of had this thing of I spent most of my time making decks to get other people involved and make sure everybody was good, and then we'd make the strategy. I remember my day one, I was in meetings with the engineers, learning about the different forms of the app. I was learning all about the tech on the back end, learning the security architecture. Then, by the way, there's meetings with the CMO to go over the brand strategy, then talking through paid marketing and analytics, working through finance and the cash flow. And suddenly what I thought was a lot of hats at American Express was minimal. Because now I need to be that expert for all my partners. So I had to become much more technical than I ever was at American Express, despite being an innovation tech person. Because these are the types of questions that you're going to get. And a lot of times when you have these meetings, you have one shot. So you need to be an expert on all these different things. It's, sometimes you can duck out and say, I'll get back to you. But those were the kinds of things that I had to learn really fast that I never once had to do at Amex. You just pull in, people to represent those groups. But I was representing the company in all these things now.
Very interesting. Guy, I just invited you to join because I feel like you've probably got a perspective having been on the startup side as well, and selling to large. You have a perspective. So when you're able to jump in, let us know. Until then, so your day one, you kind of had the world was your oyster. You no more deck writing, which sounds delightful. Having been on the other side. I know all too well how many PowerPoint decks we churn through, usually into a void. So kind of what was next?
I mean, honestly, we got right to work. I think the first thing that we did, maybe in the second half of my day, is we put together a pitch deck specifically targeting banks and networks on the value prop that we could do. And when I say pitch deck, I mean demo video, the actual slides. We were coming up with specific talking points because, what we knew from working at banks is they're all kind of like a very long game of telephone. You get kind of one chance to pitch somebody, and then they're going to take your deck or your video or whatever it is, and they're going to be the ones that are pitching it internally. By the time it gets to that second or third person, it's not going to be that same story anymore, and you're not going to get anywhere. So we actually invest a lot of time in making sure that we're crafting a great representation of our product from the video, the demo, all the main talking points. But we're also spending a lot of time in that first pitch meeting learning about the people that we're working with, because it isn't, hey, here's what's good for American Express. It's, hey, here's what's good for this very specific director we're talking about. Here's what they care about before the end of the year. And by the way, here's what their boss cares about and how we can help them achieve those goals. So, we spent a lot of time figuring out the assets, and those are super important, but just as important, figuring out who our contacts were, who we can get in front of, and how we can make them successful, because that was the most important thing.
And so how did you go about just doing that kind of due diligence to say, I know what you, Jim, are thinking about and how I can solve your challenges? I think that makes a lot of sense. That, ultimately I often kind of talk about this idea that there's a kind of two sides of of the company mind that you need to think about the big company mind. There's the individual mind and why they will give a damn about what you have to offer, and then how their kind of role fits into the company mind, and how not only are they motivated to kind of advocate on your behalf, but do they have the position in the company where they have control over anything, or the ability to be a voice that's listened to, et cetera. So how did you go about deciphering?
Honestly, we got lucky in the beginning just because where we came from, and part of that was specifically why Dashlane hired us. So my background is American Express. My former boss, he was Visa and Square. So we started with essentially connections that we knew from those networks, from those banks where we could start and just get a sense of the lay of the land. Who was working in innovation roles at those times? What were their top 3 goals for the year? Generally, you can kind of make an assumption that they're all relatively similar. They don't necessarily change a whole lot. But seeing if we could get, hey, here's the 3 positioning statements they're working off for Q3, Q4. How can we tailor those together? We got lucky with our first few. From there, you start to kind of run out of contacts and you're going with cold call LinkedIn messaging, right? For those guys, we were focused on crafting a message that says, hey, here's Dashlane is, by the way, we got 10 million users, 7,000 businesses. We've won all these awards. You're featured in the Times. We can solve for you, which are generally high level challenges. And, let's talk a little bit more about what it is going to be for you in that time. So that was really our focus. Try to get them to talk.
Yeah. Hey, Shri, good to see you. Thanks for joining in.
Howdy. Thank you. Thanks, guys, for hosting this, and thanks to Allison for your time.
Yeah, of course. So, Shri, I was actually curious to get your perspective, because I feel like you've also been on both sides. You're in the complex field of securities for private companies as a co-founder of EquityZen. Have you experienced any of these same kinds of challenges of getting in the door with large companies that you guys are trying to kind of both sell securities for private companies too, or the other way around of kind of get folks on board with your platform?
Sure. Yeah. I'll say that I've dealt less so with kind of being on the Goliath side. That I haven't had the privilege of being in that position yet, but definitely have dealt with from multiple facets, trying to convince larger private issuers to work with us. Issuers meaning like companies who issue private stock, and there are kind of a unique set of challenges there, which is something I've focused on for the last few years, and more recently I've kind of turned my attention to trying to work with larger financial institutions to partner with them as a distribution channel. And just as a quick background, we operate an online investments business where we help employees at large private companies think like larger startups in the vein of like Lyft and Spotify and DocuSign and companies like that when they were private, at least for the last 2, help them get liquidity prior to the company going public or getting acquired. And on the other side, try to match them with investors who want access to this asset class. So the problem that one of the challenges I'm trying to solve right now is, the distribution side. And one of the things they're working on is trying to partner with some of these, there are investment platforms that aggregate certain financial products like alternative investments like ours, or there are like wealth managers who have, a whole set of clients who might be interested in something like this. And, that's been like a tough nut to crack. We've had different folks at the company working on it for a couple of years. And now I'm kind of tasked with trying to get our product listed on one of these like distribution platforms. Happy to highlight what the initial set of challenges and pushback is. If that's helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be great to hear a little more about that. I feel like Allison was just talking a little bit about how she's gotten the door through her own relationships. I'd love to also hear, in addition to some of the general experiences you've had, Shri, how did you kind of open the door to some of those things?
I'm also very curious. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the company side, so we used a few different techniques, I would say. So for the company side, the idea was basically, hey, we want to work with the company and get them to refer these selling shareholders directly to us and kind of be seen as a friendly partner to them. And it involved actually a lot of, kind of like changing hearts and minds or whatever, because private companies, there's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction against liquidity. They think you're like misaligning their employees with the companies by allowing them to sell shares along the way. So one of the challenges was getting them to understand that, if you want to be able to control your destiny and stay private, double or triple the length that companies used to, you need to actually solve the liquidity problem. We're not creating the problem. We're trying to solve this existing problem. Second component was letting companies know that, hey, this can actually be a tool, like an arrow in your quiver. You could use this as, you could kind of like take ownership of it and frame it as a benefit that you're offering, right, to their employees. And now it's a retention and morale tool. And it'll help employees stay productive by allowing them to focus on work and not being distracted by personal financial issues. So trying to like identify how it solves pain points for the company and identifying who those stakeholders were, because typically, we'd have to talk to general counsels or CFOs of these companies, and they weren't very receptive to some of the latter things I just said. Their take was, I want everything to be nice and neat and in order, and this idea of liquidity is not on the top 5 lists of like what my mandate and things are. So I don't really care about this. But if you're talking about the chief people officer or the HR, like head of HR, or like a founder or CEO, they're very much invested in talent recruitment and retention. So that, they care. So, trying to find the right voice was something that helped. Additionally, we took a bit of a bottoms-up approach as well as this top-down approach, which was, empower the employees to say, hey, this is something we want. And then, then the companies would want to try to support that. And we tried to lower the bar at first as well, which was, hey, let's do a smaller transaction with one employee. It's going to be lower risk for you. And once, you deal with us, then you will establish a track record of, you can get to know us. You'll realize that we could be a trusted partner who is not going to make waves, and we're actually going to account for the things that you care about. And we kind of used a couple of these smaller transactions as like a Trojan horse to get in with the company. And then, maybe 6-12 months later, you start seeing the dividends pay off on that, where then you can approach them about, hey, let's talk about liquidity, or is there a way we can become, a preferred liquidity provider? Can you, when you get internal referrals, we're happy to, when you get internal questions, we're happy to then take that referral.
That's interesting there, because like, even though the product you're talking about is seemingly very complicated financial transaction for these employees that have, illiquid shares in private company that you guys can help them sell. But one of the things that you just suggested, it sounds very similar to what Allison was saying earlier, which is that you're finding an advocate, even if it's not necessarily someone who's the chief people officer or chief counsel or whomever, that they may or may not see what value you offer, and they may or may not be to invest in a relationship with you. You're going to the advocate's employee who has some shares that they want to kind of sell and kind of work your way up. And they're the ones who have a specific
That's
incentive.
right. And then there are certain leaders who are also incentivized to be your advocate. So I think identifying who's going to be your internal champion, and then identifying who's going to be like the decision maker, to the extent those are two different people, I think is important early on.
Yeah.
And then, kind of what Allison was saying, someone internally is going to take your story and run with it, and it might change over time, but identify who that person is, and then make sure you can align yourself with what their goals are. A lot of times it's like, how can you help them succeed with what their mandate is? And I kind of like identify that win-win, and then hopefully take it from there. On the flip side, with the distribution side, it's been a lot more challenging, because when you want to list a financial product with an established market player, say like an E-Trade or one of these RIAs who have substantial legal risk, they also don't want to take on the reputational harm of dealing with someone who's not known. And if in a highly regulated industry, it's something to keep in mind of, where they don't want by association to take on any reputational or operational or legal risk. So that's like something to keep in mind and try to solve for right away.
Yeah. Yeah, that's challenging. We've had a similar thing now that, Dashlane is inherently a security product. And, we're working with some of the most risk conservative companies on the planet. Like most of my companies are banks, networks, and insurance companies. So one of our differentiators is that we actually have a patent on our security architecture, which is totally unique for our vertical. And that alone has actually been a huge difference for us. We actually look forward to security reviews that we actually encourage them to do them upfront and early because it's really served as a differentiator for us. We actually published a white paper for our security architecture, so anybody can go online and read exactly what we're doing. We're very upfront, open, and transparent about it because even if we're unclear, just like something is unclear, that causes a doubt on their mind, and that's something that's really hard to overcome from the brand risk side, from everything. It's really challenging. So we are the biggest advocates of transparency and just trying to give as much information as we can, because these types of partners, especially in financial side, that's really challenging to overcome, especially internally, even for an advocate.
Right. So one thing we're trying out now, and happy to report back at some point on how it goes, is we're trying to identify in advance, like, hey, what are some of the operational due diligence type things that the partners are going to want to know? And let's see if we could do like a readiness exercise in advance of that. And so I'm working with some folks on my team to try to identify, hey, if we could come up with our own checklist of what we think people are going to ask us, how much of it can we accomplish ahead of time, if not all of it, or at least we'll know that there are some major gating issues, and then there's going to be some internal kind of like selling to do to get the approvals to do some maybe high cost things to get to this readiness point. So this way we could walk into a meeting saying like, oh yeah, here, like all of these boxes are checked. You don't need to worry about anything. And also agree with the transparency point. In our industry, at least, there's like, FINRA is the regulator, and they have like public disclosures about companies where it's like, hey, if they've ever had any issues, it's made as an investor protection matter open to the public. So, I've definitely put it in the pitch deck that, hey, here's a link to our report. FYI, we have 0 disclosures. So hopefully that will like clear things up straight away.
That's huge. We've actually gone a similar route by kind of, now that we've had enough partners in the FI and insurance space, we've actually just created a packet of essentially upfront, hey, here's all of our security requirements, here's everything, like preemptively knowing what they're going to ask, because one, it saves a ton of time. Most of the people that are dealing with business side, that's like the worst part of their job. They hate dealing with it. It makes us look much better as a potential partner. But it also shows we have credibility in this space and understand what we're talking about, respect them as a partner. So that has been a huge changer for us, just having those things available. We've probably saved 2 to 3 months on deals.
Great.
So, Allison, you're saying that basically having all of those kind of due diligence items at a time is kind of saving the time that you were worried about when you were on the product development side of it, right? Like you were going to have to go through all those committees and write all those PowerPoint decks to kind of prove out that this is the right way to go about things.
Exactly.
You have to make it easier for the other company as a startup.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, if you start coming up with a concept at a company that, a large organization, you have to meet with privacy, you meet with regulatory, you meet with like 3 different legal teams, brand risk, compliance, all these different groups. And if you can say to them, hey, by the way, here's something to review and react to. By the way, the company's already thought of it. They've done similar partnerships. It's a very different conversation than, hey, here's an idea. What holes can you poke in this? And then try to come up with something to respond to. That takes another 2 months. They're already coming from it, like a poke holes in it thing. It's a conversation if it's starting there.
Yeah. Well, hey, Guy.
Hey. Pretty good.
How's it
Thanks
going?
for having me on.
You've probably got a good perspective here because you've done a lot of working from the startup side with giant companies. Any thoughts on like tips and tricks that you learned to kind of get in the door, or as we've been talking about now, smooth the pathway once you're already in?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Allison about sort of working with banks, right? These are some of the people in the world that wants to take the least amount of risks. And I in my career, worked with the defense contractors. which I think are equally difficult to deal with. So
that might be worse.
Yeah, I had a lot of trouble breaking through the door. I find that once you're there, it's easy to make your case and get a champion and get people to buy into what you're trying to do with them and show them the way and sort of handhold them. But
Yep.
getting that first meeting even is the most difficult part. So what is some of the things that you do to get through to that? How do you get the first meeting at Goldman or at JP or at Bank of America?
Yep. It's really been two routes for us. The first one, just given that we have connections in that space, that's how we got in. Originally, it was hopefully you find somebody that you trust that can do a warm handoff, even if it's not the right group. Just figure out a pathway to get to that right group. Just you kind of need to kick the first door down. And from someone like the bank side, a connection really helps. If you don't have the connection at those guys, which we often don't, and even we didn't at some of the banks, we would position a little differently and say, here's our solution. We have all these accolades and awards, or just something that gives that trust factor. By the way, we've worked with all these other big names, and we would actually intentionally craft it to say, if I'm going after banks, I would reference our insurance clients and say, hey, I have a partnership with Chubb Insurance, big names they would know, proven trust, and say, but by the way, we're expanding into your industry and would love to have you guys be the first to market. That's generally how we've tried to position it, because as long as you have some credibility from the accolades or the awards or big names and other things, that helps. And then saying that you can be first to market, or we kind of came up with a solution we think would be great for you guys, like something to drive a bit of urgency. That's what's helped us. But you're right, it's super challenging at a company that doesn't have a lot of risk. The only other way that we've been able to do it in places where we just couldn't get anything is literally blast everyone with a demo video of our product, because slides don't mean anything at this point. They're not interactive. They don't show, a flat demonstration doesn't show anything, especially for our product. But people are naturally curious. And if you come up with a demo video, especially one that you've worked their company brand into somehow, they'll want to show it to other people. So we've had to get creative. I'm the biggest proponent of investing in your pitch materials, much more so. Be creative, somehow come up with a way to stick it. But we fortunately haven't had to do as much as the third one. It's a little more high touch, obviously. But we have had to resort to that in the past just to get attention on us.
Yeah. Some of the things that we've done, if we weren't able to get a warm introduction, like you mentioned, was just we spent a lot of money on trade shows. I'm talking, $100,000, $200,000 on a big booth to sort of make these guys walk in, and then you have the immediate credibility of having a big presence at an important show, and with that, it's very hard to just go in cold. A follow-up question that I had is, so now you're in and you have the years of the big company, right? Now, what about deal cycle? Because a lot of these companies move very slow, and a startup often has such limited resources, right? That a startup might be working with an 18-month runway before they raise their next round, and a deal cycle might be 24 months, right? So how do you explain to your CEO we should invest in this 24-month deal cycle? It's a good thing for us to be doing, because that's something that I've had to deal with. I've even had to deal with 36-month deal cycles. And it's hard to get buy-in from a CEO of a startup that's thinking only 6 months out.
Yeah, it's really tricky. We've run into the same thing, especially with our types of partners. We're lucky if we get a contract in 8 to 10 months. Fortunately, we've had our senior executives have kind of given us a little bit of runway, so we're lucky on that side. However, really the way that we've had to approach it is by essentially saying, okay, yes, this may take 18 months, let's say, but we focus on breaking those up into chunks. I am the biggest world proponent of doing pilots, very lightweight pilots, and getting out there with an MVP, because when you think about what you need to succeed with a big company, think about the person you're dealing with on the other end. They're probably in that role for 18 months. I don't even want to, they'll probably be in some other different thing by the time you're done with that deal. So all that person cares about is in that 12-month time, coming up with, hey, I launched this and got these results, and using that for, I don't care if it's their next job or their year-end review or something. And that sounds super narcissistic, but it's kind of true.
No,
so,
I tell people that all the time is,
exactly.
When I look at someone else on the other side, how do I get them promoted, right? How do I get them to get their KPIs up and look good for their boss? That's my main goal.
Exactly. So we focus on doing the most lightweight possibles ever, or lightweight pilots with like very clear metrics of success. And we don't oversell those. Like, we're not going to oversell them because I'm not putting 6 months in where we don't think we're ever going to hit that. We have a super robust analytics team on our side. So we'll build models with the partner and we'll say, hey, listen, here's what we're expecting. Here's all the different trigger points. If you want to boost up the marketing, here's how we can change. Here's what the impact would be. And we're collaborating on those models all the time. But when we do a pilot with a bank, at this point, what we invest in it is we'll create a landing page. We've built them in a scalable way. We'll create an offer for your customers. You guys send one email and let's see how it goes. We try to take out everything that could potentially go longer. Like, we don't charge because then you don't have to get finance involved.
Yeah.
We don't do anything that requires a super heavy contract. We'll keep it US only. We'll keep it focused on one card thing. Whatever obstacles you can remove, and therefore whatever teams you can remove from the cycle to actually get a lightweight pilot off the ground, that is like the biggest thing. Because if you have success at the end of that pilot, then whoever is the next person, whether it's someone joining in from the new role or it's a more senior leader, like, they want to jump on a successful pilot and roll it out, right? So whatever you can get to quick pilot, I'm biggest proponent of.
Yeah, one advice that I haven't heard before was the don't charge part. I've also used pilots as a way to start working with a big company and then move from there. But I've had to navigate different budgets and being able to at least get paid something. But yeah, I'll keep that trick in my sleeve for the future.
I just knew I couldn't, because most of the companies that I'm working with set their budgets like 6 months in advance. And to get a pilot, even to give me like 20K, which to them is peanuts, still requires getting another team involved, and it requires taking funds from something else. So we came up with a way to do it super lightweight. We literally build the same landing page, swap in a logo, come up with an email, swap in a logo. So it wasn't too high investment for us. But we didn't want to put them through that.
Sounds good. Hey, Brett.
Hey, how's it going?
Jumped into, I know you had a question, Brett, in a second, but I just want to make one comment, because Allison is really a good insight here, which is like, you talk about pilots. I think when we think about that, we think about shrinking the scope or the timeline or what have you of a particular product. But you reference like piloting with just as few teams as possible. And that's something that I think is really important to recognize from the startup side, that we often look at a company like it's American Express or it's whatever, large company XYZ, and think of them as this monolith. But really, there's all these fiefdoms inside that the more of those different small groups you have to incorporate, like finance, to the point of not charging, or other teams that have to weigh in, the more complicated it becomes. And so piloting by feature or piloting by time period, but most importantly, piloting by how many teams need to give their thumbs up was really interesting.
Definitely.
Brett, I know you said you had a question.
Yeah, so you kind of answered it a little bit, Allison, with just value added. Like, what is your, how can you add value? Like, even when you're just trying to get in the door cold, that's something I've been playing with a little bit lately, is just when I'm asking for any information, how am I adding value to them right then and there so that they're just going to respond to my email? You mentioned the we're going to get you promoted. We're going to move you and give you a nice jumping off point. But how do you just get past that initial barrier of, look at me and look what I have to say? I'm David, you're Goliath. Why do you even care?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that's one of the hardest things to do. What I try to do, especially if I'm doing like a LinkedIn message that's just super cold, it's 3 bullets on here's my product, here's what we can do. And then it's, by the way, we can get in market in the next 90 days with 0 upfront investment for you. Do you have 15 minutes just to run through the plan real quick? Like, as long as you can say, hey, I can get you in market with no cost, which, may not necessarily be true, like figure out the best way you can kind of structure that. But if I hear that, then I'm paying a little bit more attention, especially if it's mid-year and maybe I'm not exactly where I want to be. If I'm trying to launch some giant thing internally, that's not going to happen for me by the end of the year. But doing some kind of cool partnership that I can get off the ground with a really innovative startup, that's a different conversation. So that's usually a way to help get in the door. And then it's also the other thing that I mentioned earlier. If I hear from a startup, especially if I heard from one loves Amex that was working in an industry and just starting to move into mine and could still move fast, that gave them a little bit more credibility. So if you have the ability, like the reason banks and networks and big companies work with startups is because they're fast and generally their tech is better. So the more you can play up those things, the better, especially if you can get results quickly.
Awesome. And then I had one other thought. I feel like it's kind of a silly question, but no question is silly or stupid, right? So have you experienced kickback from the CEO or the founders of the startups when saying, hey, I would like to go approach this Goliath, and they have all kinds of hesitations, or for some reason they just won't, they just don't buy in to that idea? What are some of the approaches you take to addressing those situations?
Yeah, that's not a silly question at all. Dashlane, for context, was founded by 4 founders, all went to school together in France, and our CEO has been with the company almost since the beginning. So they're all very invested in the product. And then, they hired me kind of like year 5, year 6. And I'm like, but let's go partner with banks. And by the way, I need you to invest all this work, do all these things that aren't really core central to the product to do this. So we've definitely had that before. The good thing is those guys have made me much better at, it isn't just the value prop of the partnership, it's what is this going to do for Dashlane internally? So they've really challenged me to think about the different types of deals that we're doing, and making sure that I'm working with analytics to blow out and say, hey, okay, if we do this, here's a way that we can tighten up the investment, but here's what it would do to the MAUs. Like, the best part about working at startups is you have good analytics. Like when I worked at Amex, it would take 2 months to get a report on anything.
Right.
Working with them and collaborating with ways to reduce the upfront investment, but still working together on the model, that's helpful. Getting them in the room, often with senior people from the other companies, and making sure that those visions match up, that's really helpful. Because I think sometimes even executives on the startup sides will make the mistake of thinking Amex thinks this, but it's really, what is this person's role do, and like how can that help the company? And you have to sometimes, even from the startup side, there's kind of that thing where you're like, oh, I need to get like every deal I can get, and that's not true. Any deal that you get anywhere should be something that aligns with the overall value prop of the company. So there's been deals that we've turned down with big companies because they didn't follow our ethos, and we knew that they just wanted to sign a fancy startup. They didn't really want it for the end game. So making sure that the senior leadership on both sides is bought into the same goals, that really helps.
Right. Gotcha.
Like, that's a good kind of cautionary tale to be mindful of from the startup side, which is that, in the startup side, maybe it's hard to get in the door, but when you can, it's not necessarily the right door for you, and you have less chances to get it wrong. And for a large company, you release a product that no one cares about, move on to the next thing, but a startup can kill you.
Exactly.
Cool.
So Shri, I know you had another question around once you're in the door, kind of the demo. Maybe you want to share a little more about your thoughts there.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm off mute. Yeah, no. Allison had just mentioned saying that it's completely worthwhile to invest in the pitch materials. Just wondering, you mean like spending internal time and resources on it, or let's get an outsourced designer to come in and maybe spend $1,000 or a couple $1,000, whatever it might be, to go and like really make the substance into something that's pretty slick, or go and like pay for some kind of like video or something else that has like higher production value. Are you saying that, or just like spend the time internally and kind of like nail the substance on identifying where the value proposition is, and things like that?
I think it's more about spending the time internally and really nailing down that value prop. Like, you know, I've worked with companies that may be impressed, like might be impressed for a second, like with a slick wrapper on top of it, but it's more about just doing the basics, like a screencast of your video and a demo. You'd be surprised how many startups reached out to me, you know, as an Amex, and would send me like a screenshot of one screen and then like 17 bullets, and I had absolutely no idea what the product did. So at the basic, you know, having a demo of here's the screens, it's super easy, like that alone, and then coming up with just like a couple bullet points with like a really well-crafted value prop that put those together. So I think those are super helpful. One of the ways that we've actually gotten through it is once we signed some of our early marketing partnerships, we actually negotiated as part of the work we were doing with companies that, like for example, one of our early partnerships with Intel, we signed a co-marketing budget with them because we knew they had obviously a very large marketing budget. And they actually paid for some marketing assets for us, which we then reused in other deals. So we didn't really get to work with a ton of designers on anything until we had funds from big companies. And that was a pretty easy give on their side. They have a lot of like A&P budget by the end of the year. They're happy to give up to us, especially if their logo goes near the end. But I would focus on, you know, you can literally just take a screencast of your product, come up with your bullet points and make sure they're relevant versus something super high level with one shot. Like people can tell how much work you put into them. They're not impressed by fancy wrappers. They're impressed by the substance of the value prop, and especially one that's specific.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying that. I had one more question as well, if there's time, Scott. Cool.
Yeah, go for it.
So one of the things that you know, I've encountered on the distribution side when dealing with, you know, banks and wealth managers, et cetera, the Goliaths in this world, is a lot of times they want to see a certain number of years of track record for performance, for being in the industry, for knowing that you're not fly by night. In the absence of that, have you had any kind of like go-to markers or proxies for the track record to say, hey, we haven't been around for 5 years with this product, but here's, you know, a couple alternative data points that might help you achieve the same comfort you're looking for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. That's challenging, especially in the space that you're in, especially working with FIs. So we've only had the product for a couple years, but the challenge is there's actually very limited category awareness of password managers, let alone the brand awareness of Dashlane. So we're kind of in that similar space where since people don't understand password managers, they don't really know whether to trust them or not. So obviously our patent was a game changer for us. That definitely helped. But what we've also really focused on, general the security track record, but our retention rates for our customers, especially in the premium side. So Dashlane as a service is a free app to download, but if you want to use it across all your devices, that's our premium service. And our retention rates are sky high, like 3-4 times multiple of other players in kind of general app markets, because once people try the product, they love it and they stick with it. So that's something that's been super compelling as we've worked with different banks and networks. They want to create benefits that actually mean something to their customers. Plus, a lot of banks and networks work with us because they want to, you know, keep people sticky to their cards. So working with a high retention company like us has been super valuable for them.
Got it. Thank you.
Awesome. So I know we're almost out of time, but as referenced, Guy just made a comment in the sidebar here about investors not necessarily appreciating or having the realization of what you were talking about before, Allison, about turning away large Fortune 500 partners, but recognizing how important it is from the inside. Investors may not be aligned with that, but definitely important to keep all the chips you've got saved up for the right bets to make. So hopefully this video is something you can show your investors, Guy. Get a few folks kind of nodding along to the idea that you got to make sure you save those chips for a rainy day.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I know we're just about out of time. Allison, any other final thoughts to share with the rest of the group?
No, this has been fun. I think the only thing I would just really encourage everyone to remember is really to focus on making those really specific value props, just listening all the time about what the people that you're working with care about. It's the most overlooked thing. It seems so basic, but really understanding what the goals of this person are, kind of crafting your value prop a different way. And, don't be afraid to say, okay, this isn't a fit right now, and move on to the next. There's going to be a lot of these different companies out there that can offer you opportunities. At a certain point, people kind of forget that they almost have their own limited resources on their side, even from the BD side. So generally, if you hit on a value prop, there's going to be 10 different players in that space that are good opportunities. So, if one's not working, don't be afraid to move on to the next one.
Yeah. I think a key takeaway that I got from all this is that, we talk about Davids and Goliaths and often think that, being the smaller one is the harder position to be in. But I think we have to remember who actually won at the end of that story and recognize when you've got a play to make. So, Allison, thanks so much for leading this conversation, and everyone else who joined. Thank you all for joining for the first Firneo Business Development Roundtable about how startups partner with large companies. More of these to come, and we'll look forward to seeing you all within the Firneo community and at some events sometime soon. So talk to you all soon.
Thanks, guys. See you.
Awesome.